UFO literature features numerous cases in which dogs interact with strange beings and cryptids, though it's not very often they manage to attack. Typically, the beings are able to repel them via devices and/or some type of telepathy. In most cases, the animals run in fear when confronted by these otherworldly entities, but not always. Join me as I delve into dogs versus the paranormal. A farmer out milking his cows late at night encounters a strange entity. The sighting of this thing rouses the farmer's dog, who becomes enraged. It immediately goes after the creature. This is the Mount Airy incident. In early 1981, the Mount Airy News received a letter from a local man who described a very bizarre and frightening encounter on his farm. Gray Barker would write about the case in the 1981 edition of the UFO Annual Newsletter. It was also featured in Timothy Green Beckley's UFO Review, issue 11. The encounter is, as far as I know, one of only a handful of incidents in which a dog was said to have attacked one of these visitors. The witness, who chose to remain anonymous, possibly for fear of ridicule, claims that he had a busy day and was quite late when he finally went out to milk his cows. He wasn't certain of the exact date, only that it was in the first week of February 1981 on his farm near Mount Airy in North Carolina. Joining him was his faithful hunting dog. As he sat milking the cows, utilizing the light from the barn to see, the farmer was surprised when his dog began barking wildly at something off in the field. It took off running, sniffing the ground. The farmer looked, but he could not see anything in the darkness. He became quite concerned, given how excited the dog was, and decided it was best to figure out what was going on. He left the cows and began following the dog across the field and up to a wooded area at the top of the hill. As he drew closer, he could tell that the dog was involved in some kind of struggle. It was fighting something quite fiercely, growling and carrying on. Suddenly it stopped and backed away, just as its master reached the spot. Apparently his dog had gotten something, and it lay there in a heap. Using the light from his flashlight, the farmer took one look at the creature and had to catch his breath. He could not believe what he was looking at. This creature appeared humanoid, but it was not human. It was apparently still alive, though its legs and arms were badly mangled. It was in terrible shape. Strangely, he could not discern any blood despite the obvious wounds. The farmer stared at this thing, noting that it had pale skin, was completely hairless, with a very large head and small frog-like hands. It did not appear to have a nose or a mouth, though its eyes were noticeably large. The longer the farmer stared at this creature, the more frightened he became. Thoughts raced through his mind, namely, what was this thing, and could it possibly be some kind of deformed human? He thought it unlikely, but he wasn't certain, and he feared getting into trouble. The farmer was so confused and creeped out that he elected to not stay at his farm. He promptly got into his car and left. He drove into town and booked a motel. For whatever reason, he felt safer knowing that people were literally right down the hall. Back at his farm, strange things were taking place, though he would not be aware of this until the next morning. Upon rising the next day, he drove back to his farm. He decided that if the creature was still there, he was going to notify the police. Upon exiting his car, he cautiously approached the site where the creature had fallen. Whatever this creature was, it apparently had left during the evening, or was taken, because when the farmer looked, it was gone. He checked the area around the spot and found nothing. The farmer called for his dog, and strangely, it did not come. He found this odd, as the animal would always return when called. No matter how many times he called, the animal never responded, and he began to think the worst. Upon making his way back to his house, his suspicions proved true. For there, lying in his yard, was his dog. It was dead. In just a few hours, this seemingly healthy dog had passed away. The farmer decided it best to check the rest of his animals. He made his way out to the barn and realized that at least 2 of his cows were missing. The farmer checked the area around his property but found no sign of them. They had simply vanished. The farmer, so badly frightened by the incident, penned a letter to the newspaper describing what had happened. He also provided a drawing of the creature. He insisted that he would come forward and reveal his name to the editors if other locals came forward with similar experiences, though nobody ever did, and it remains unclear if the witness ever confided his name. In this case, the farmer's dog may have very well fatally injured the creature, which, just going by his drawing, appears to be a Grey-type being. In a weird turn, it seems the entities exacted their revenge later that evening, apparently killing the dog and making off with 2 of the farmer's cows. I have a sense that had the farmer elected to remain on his property that night, he too may have felt the wrath of these creatures. He might very well be just another missing person referenced in one of David Paulides' books. It makes me wonder if his decision to leave his farm was actually his own, or rather some other force compelling him to leave, for if he didn't, he would not make it through the night. In mid-September 1962, in El Capon in Salta in Argentina, Lopez Andrade, his wife, and their 3 children were just sitting down for dinner when somebody stood in front of their kitchen window, looking in. He was less than 5 meters from them. The family members looked over and stared at this person in shock. It didn't take long for them to realize that this wasn't a person at all, but some weird creature they had never seen before. It stood about 3 meters tall and appeared to be clad in a type of silvery outfit. His dogs, sitting outside, suddenly became alerted to the figure. Fearing that he might be a threat to their masters, they immediately bolted up to the window and began attacking the entity. At the same time, Lopez rushed and grabbed his rifle. He rushed outside and fired off a round in the direction of the entity, which suddenly vanished in plain sight. Lopez likened it to some kind of magic trick, though it was enough to frighten him and his family. Later, upon inspecting the dogs, Lopez noted that one of them had its hair scorched. This account appeared in the September 18, 1962 issue of La Raison. Probably one of the most shocking incidents involving dogs attacking entities occurred in Juarez, Mexico in 1963. The witness, a 15-year-old boy, was with his family visiting relatives in Juarez when he fell ill with the flu. His family felt it best he remain in bed. He spent the night sleeping. Later he woke up in the middle of the night to find himself all alone in the house. He thought it strange but remembered that they were invited to a large reunion at another cousin's house, sort of a final goodbye party before they headed back to California. Since he couldn't do much but wait for them to come back, he headed back to bed and laid down. He noticed that he was feeling much better now. He tried to get back to sleep but found that he couldn't. He then took notice of the dog's barking. He would have brushed it off, but noticed that the barks were frantic. He assumed briefly that his family had returned, but the barking was coming from the backyard, so he doubted that it was them. He got up and went to the window to try to see what was going on. Even though it was dark, his uncle had some poles in the yard, and there were lights attached to them so he could see somewhat well. Under one of these lights, almost at the other side of the yard next to the fence, he could see 2 of the dogs. They seemed to have cornered something. That something appeared to be some kind of a person, though he could not really make it out. It had its arms out in front as a shield against the dogs. When one of the dogs made a lunge, this person would retract his hand to avoid getting bitten. The strange thing was that this person was glowing. It had a soft silver color to it. The witness could only see on the face and the body of this person several dark spots that were constantly moving up and down. The witness felt that it might be a burglar who had tried to sneak into the yard only to be caught by the dogs. He didn't feel threatened, and as he kept watching, the glowing being would try to move away from the dogs, which only agitated them further. Suddenly, one of the dogs attacked, going for the legs. The other dog jumped and knocked down the stranger. He could see one of the stranger's arms waving like in distress. It was then that the witness became frightened and ran to the other bedroom. From there, he could still hear the melee going on outside, when suddenly a big, bright flash of light came over the whole house. It lit up everything for a few seconds, and then everything went silent. The witness was unsure of what caused the bright flash, but he could not hear the dogs anymore. He slowly went back to the window, and when he looked, the dogs and this strange figure were gone. He then noticed some lights off in the distance, moving away toward the foothills. They were too high, so he knew that this was some kind of aerial object. Too frightened to sleep, he waited until his family returned and told them what he had seen. His father and his uncle Francisco went outside to check. They were able to find evidence in the flower bed that the dogs had indeed cornered something, and some kind of skirmish took place. They also found several dead chickens and rabbits. There were no signs of trauma on them. They were just dead. As for the dogs, their bodies were found the next day several miles down the road in a field. Again, no signs of trauma. How they got there, nobody knows. The third dog, Max, which he didn't see that night, was never found. His fate remains a mystery. Within a year of the incident, the uncle sold the house and moved away. In this final case, I figured I'd leave off with a story about a hunter that encountered something strange in the forest, and what became of its dog after it decided to chase after it. It was November 1972, near Scranton, Pennsylvania. A man was out deer hunting on a damp, bitter cold night. He had brought his two trusted hunting dogs, Joe and Samson, along for the trip. They were in some deep woods surrounded by pine when Samson began whining and cowering. Joe, his other dog, seemed fine. They continued on further into the bush when, after about 5 minutes, a putrid stench seemed to fill the air. He described it as a mix of human waste, a rotting carcass, and garbage. It was absolutely disgusting. This is when Joe began to react. He flattened back his ears and growled at something in the darkness. Samson too began to growl. The hunter had his spotlight with him, and he shone it in the direction where the two dogs were barking. What he saw next gave him the chills. Two gleaming red eyes reflected back at him from an enormous, all black, blacker than black shadow about 40 yards away. He recalled that this entity stood at least 8 feet tall. He was certain that whatever this beast was, it was what was giving off this horrible odor. The witness immediately grabbed hold of Samson's collar, but he was not quick enough to grab Joe's, and the dog tore after the creature. The beast backed away slowly and retreated into the dark forest, seemingly unalarmed. It did not turn and rush off, it merely backed away and carried on. Fearful for the safety of his dog, the hunter strained his ears. He listened for Joe's barks and howls for some time when they began to fade. The hunter felt it was unsafe, and there was nothing he could do for Joe, so he turned and began heading back. He desperately wanted to see if his dog was okay, but would not go further, knowing that that creature was out there lurking around. When he arrived home, he told his family what happened, about how Joe had taken off after some strange creature that he could not identify. Although he too agreed that it sounded like a crazy story, with his family's urging, he made a report about the incident to the police. The next day, they were in for a shock when his son Paul came home, carrying Joe in his arms. Paul claimed that he had found Joe lying on the side of the road when he was driving into town. He thought Joe was dead at first, since he was just lying there, but he was not, just very, very frightened. For many weeks afterwards, Joe continued to cower and walk around with his tail between his legs, fearful of everything and anything. The family had no idea what happened to that dog. It is unclear to me exactly what this hunter encountered. I initially assumed that it was a Bigfoot, but he does not indicate seeing any hair, only that it was black, almost like a shadow man. There are reports of hunters encountering shadowy entities out in the woods, so maybe that is what he saw. I do wonder what exactly occurred with the animal and the creature. Certainly the dog had no fear initially, as it chased after it, so something must have transpired that traumatized him. What that is anyone's guess. Anyway, that's this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed.